So there's a belief that anyone who isn't Jewish must, on some level,
By
according to them.
default, hates the Jews. That's the general belief.
Where does that belief come from, or what's the thinking behind it?
There's a lot of generational trauma where I come from.
You're listening to The Brendon Marotta Show.
In this episode, I talked to Ari Hershkowitz, whose journey questioning Hasidic Judaism is explored in the Netflix documentary One of Us. During this episode, we talk about Ari's experiences leaving that community, going through his own healing journey, and then eventually returning to that community. We also talk about how the Hasidic Jewish community is changing, how they respond to criticism from within the community and outside the community, and their definition of Jewish identity. Now, here is Ari. Thank you so much for talking with me. For people who are not familiar with the world that you grew up in, the Hasidic community, how would you describe that experience? So if you were talking to someone who just had no familiarity with that world, maybe someone from a foreign country or who just had never met a Hasidic person, how would you describe what that community is?
All right, Hasidic Judaism is a small fraction of Judaism, which is a religion and a culture and an ethnicity. Hasidic Judaism is very much based on the religion of Judaism. It's very strict. Everything is taken to an extreme. Everything that is a maybe becomes a definitely, meaning if it's a potential for sin, don't do it because it's a maybe. Everything is much stricter than usual, and some would even describe it as a cult,
I
like a cult-like environment.
Yeah, that sounds like a very intense upbringing. And you were in the Netflix documentary One of Us, which shows the journey that you made. Actually, I should ask, are you fully out of that community now, or do you still have one foot in it, or where is it you are now after that?
Well, interestingly, I left completely and then later returned. And where I live now is in a Hasidic building, so I'm actually the only atheist in this building. Above me, there's Hasidic families, and there's actually a lot of carriages in the lobby. That's how you know this Hasidic building.
So you're in the Hasidic community, but you consider yourself an atheist.
Yes, I am very much an atheist. I'm a culturally Jewish atheist.
Okay. How does that work? Because I imagine there might be some conflict around that, but um, does that, I mean, is there a conflict around that? I don't know. How do they feel about you living
I,
among?
well, I live in a building with nice people. Um, they don't bother me. I don't bother them. Uh, you know, we don't communicate much, just on logistics and stuff. But uh, they're nice people in this building, so there's no issues.
Cool. Do you still feel like you're Hasidic or Jewish in the religious sense, or do you feel like that's you're in a different position now?
In religious sense, I'm not at all Jewish because I don't believe in the existence of a God. So the religion kind of requires that existence of a God, and I don't believe in that. So what I picked is the traditions of Judaism, which I very much appreciate and like, and appreciate the culture. And I'm proud of how much my people have suffered through and overcome. And ethnically, I'm Jewish because I was born Jewish.
So, are you living with the Hasidic community still because you like that culture and that community and the?
Yes. Yes. So in a sense I've returned, but not to the religion. I've returned to the culture.
I can relate to that experience a bit. It's funny because the two filmmakers who did the movie that you were in, One of Us, also did a movie about the community I grew up in, Jesus Camp, um, which is I had a similar experience when I left that, in that I really liked the people and I really liked the community and I liked the sense of belonging that I had among them. And at the same time, there were certain ideas I couldn't get behind. So I definitely understand that desire to continue the belonging, even if the beliefs have changed.
Right.
And I'm curious, actually, what led to your
Plus,
change?
plus, I'm very excited to see Hasidic Judaism change over the years,
Hmm.
because it has changed. Even in just in the last 10 years that I've just witnessed, it's changed a lot, and I'm excited to see where it's going. So I'm kind of sticking around for the show,
What is that show? Because
in a sense.
I don't have a front row seat to it. You might say. So
Oh.
what is happening? What is changing there?
Well, a lot of things are changing, both politically, meaning the scale of who respects who. Like the way it used to be in Hasidic Judaism is the rabbi said something, and that was the end of the. It was written in stone. Nowadays it's a lot different. It's a lot more based on reality, and there's a lot of Hasidic Jews who are how do I don't want to say woke because that word is taken, but woke
Yeah,
in a different way.
yeah, I understand what you mean. They're changing, expanding their perspective on certain issues.
Yes.
So what are some of the specific ways that it's changing, that you perceive that change happening?
For one, mental health is being talked about now. That
Hmm.
wasn't the case when I was younger. That when I was younger, it was just mental health was considered this scam that the government is playing on us or something. It was
Hmm.
not accepted at all. And if somebody had a problem, oh, you just have anger issues, figure it out. So mental health is being talked about now. That's big. Another kind of a funny thing is um, weed has kind of gotten made its way into the community.
That's I would
Not that
never have guessed
everybody's
that.
smoking. No, not that everybody's smoking, but there are a significant amount of people that are smoking, and you can kind of see the effect that it has on a community.
They're mellowing out a bit.
They're mellowing out, exactly.
So that's I would never have guessed that. But that's funny to hear. What do you think is causing the change in that community? Is it just time, or is there another factor of some kind?
Well, time is one, but the second one, I hate to agree with all the rabbis from 10 years ago, but in a way it's the internet. They used to say the internet is going to be the end of Judaism. I don't think that's true. I don't think it's the end of Judaism. But I will agree with them that the internet has changed a lot. It and I don't just mean the internet. I mean technology in general. I mean the way the world now works, where everybody's connected and everybody has access to everything. Like information is out there, and a community that lives in New York City, the part of the community that I grew up in, you can't stay away from the rest of New York City anymore.
Hmm.
So in a way, I'm agreeing with the rabbis when they said that the internet is going to be the downfall of Judaism, but I don't think it is the downfall. I think it's actually getting a lot better.
I so it's sounds like that because I remember the moment in the documentary, one of us, where there's a big stadium speaker who's talking about the influence of the internet and the horror, if you will, of seeing 11-year-olds with iPads. Is the
Right.
fear, or was the fear there, that people would be exposed to information that would cause them to question certain aspects of Judaism or their belief system? Um,
Well, the fear was that they wouldn't be able to control the information flow anymore.
hmm,
So if you look at any like strict community that keeps its members inside and doesn't want them to leave, they tightly control the information flow both in and out. So you don't hear a lot of stories that happen in the community. You don't hear that outside in the world, and vice versa. You don't hear in the community a lot of news from the outside world.
got it. So
And the internet broke that. The internet broke that wall.
So now there's information coming in from different perspectives. Because I'm going to remember in the film there being like you weren't even supposed to read secular books to your kids or things like that. But now those kids can find anything that exists on the internet and start
Right.
learning about that. It it also, one thing I always wondered about the Hasidic community is why New York was chosen as the place where there's such a high concentration of Hasidic people, because New York is some of the most expensive places to live in the country. It's got some of the most diverse groups of people. It always struck me as odd that you would choose that as a location for a very uh, insular community, or a community that wants to have a very different way of being from the rest of the world. Is there a particular reason for New York, or was it just that's where a lot of people moved and it kind of sprung up there, or is there another reason?
I don't know the reason for why New York was chosen. I do know that while you see New York City as the expensive place that is very mixed in with other communities, not very ideal for an insular community, but I think the Grand Rabbi of Satmar, the former one, um, his intention was to be upstate, I think. And there's actually a place called Kiryas Joel and other places, but Kiryas Joel is the Satmar one, the community that I grew up in, that is upstate, where they live much more insular than what I what I had growing up in Williamsburg.
Got it. So there are other communities in other parts
So
of
over
the
there, the
state.
problems that you mentioned don't exist. So the rent is cheaper. Yeah, the rent there is cheaper, and it is more insular. They have their own fire department, police department, and they can even more control the information flow.
Wow. So given that this is a community where there is not as much information coming in from other sources, how is it that you began a journey of questioning and came to a slightly different place than the majority of that community?
Well, my questions really started with really basics, like how do earthquakes happen? Like I read about it in the news, and you say God does it, but okay, how does he do it? Can I see it? Can I At first, I was kind of playing, agreeing with them. Okay, fine, it's God, but can I have some encyclopedia? I didn't even know what I was looking for, but that's what I would have helped me at the time. Um, so they weren't answering my questions. Even as simple as that was answered with God does it because he's angry or something like that, and or he's punishing or he wants to teach us a lesson or something. So I went out looking for my own answers. I went to Radio Shack. At first, I tried to ask people on the street, and that didn't go very well, because like imagine a kid coming up to you. How do earthquakes happen? How does the conversation continue?
Right.
So I went to Radio Shack, R.I.P. That store doesn't exist anymore, but they had laptops on display where I could just use it, and it was connected to the internet. And I would go there, go on Wikipedia. Once I found Wikipedia, at first it was, much harder for me. But once I found Wikipedia, I would go there, print out Wikipedia articles, um, save it on a flash drive, go to a print shop, print it out, and then bring that to school and study Wikipedia in school. So that's how my journey kind of started.
So I can relate to that as well, because I remember growing up in the Christian community that the internet was like a lifeline to a different world, and doing something similar, asking a lot of questions and being very curious about things. And so, at what point did the answers you were getting no longer satisfy, or that you begin to think maybe um, the it wasn't just that there wasn't an explanation, but that there might be someone who had, the explanations that you were being given were wrong?
Well, I wasn't really given an explanation at all. I was just told it was God. And
Hmm.
when I looked into it, I saw no, there's actual, behind the scenes stuff going on here, nature, um, that are very explainable. and I started questioning whether we need the God answer anymore.
Yeah.
Because that was the answer for everything. But if those things have other answers, why do we have this one size fits all answer for everything?
So you started questioning, and then I know that growing up in a religious community, that there's often a social price that comes with questioning, and definitely a social price that comes with choosing to leave those beliefs in any way. So, at what point did you start to consider that as a possibility? So you're being given these explanations
Consider
that,
leaving.
yeah, or changing, because I know with the Hasidic community, there's certain external things that you have to have about your appearance, and in the film, you obviously change some of those. So at what point did
Right.
those changes start to become something you were considering?
Right. So at first, when I was younger, I didn't think leaving was a possibility
Mm,
because they continuously told us if you leave, you end up in jail or in rehab, you end up on drugs. So many things that are kind of true, but they didn't say it's their fault. Um, uh, so at first I didn't think I was able to leave. You know, there's so many stories of people who are leaving and then dying and
yeah.
all these other stories. I was scared. Later I realized that it might be possible for me to leave. Let's say I was age 14, 15 or so. I realized that I might leave, but not yet. And I started planning for it, and like a half year after I turned 18, I officially came out as not religious. Like as soon as it was possible and logical for me to make the move.
And what was the reaction when you did that? How did people around you respond?
So many different responses. There was congrats. There was how dare you, like have you no shame and things like that. Um, Also, you don't think of your parents, which was funny because so many people cared about what my parents would think, and
Hmm.
they they had their own journey, but they came to accept me much more than other people would think. At the beginning, it was hard, and there was like a week of silence after I came out as not religious. There was a week of silence where we didn't really talk, and everybody was wondering what's gonna happen next. Um, and then my father had a talk with me where he set down a set of rules of, you either keep these rules or you don't stay in the house anymore. Not long after I left for Florida and started my journey there.
And at what point did you meet up with the documentary crew that was following you during this process? Or how did you meet them, I should ask?
I think I was 17 or 18, and oh, well, through a mutual friend. They reached out to a mutual friend and they were looking for a variety of stories. So they wanted to show that everyone is leaving on their own path. That there's no one path that we go on. So they wanted a variety of stories. So they reached out to a mutual friend, and he happened to recommend me because that's when I was, announcing that I was leaving the community.
And what was the experience of being a part of that film like?
To be honest, much of the experience is somewhat in a blur because I was high a lot of the time. Not that nothing bad for the film crew. They didn't do it to me. That was my choice at the time. Um, but it kind of gave me a purpose in a way because I was like
Hmm.
at the time you gotta understand I was very depressed. I was actively using hard drugs and I didn't really care about my life as much. It was more I was kind of just living, existing, and having the opportunity to share my story that will hopefully help someone one day was kind of like okay, I have a reason to get out of bed today.
Yeah. I understand that because I know, if you've had all of these rules put on you your whole life, that you're not allowed to do anything when those rules are no longer being imposed. There's a bit of like, what can I do? And also,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I shouldn't project my own experiences leaving a religious community, but what was the how is it that that was something that you came to do or explore? I know in the film you mentioned just wanting to have new experiences because you're from a community that only allowed certain experiences. So was it just like wanting to try things, or was there something else to it?
Could you repeat the question? It was a bit choppy.
What is it that drew you to the experiences you were having once you left the Hasidic community? So, including things like drugs, but also the travel you were doing and the other things you were exploring.
Right. Well, the drug started in the community. It started way before I left the community. The drug started basically as soon as I realized that I'm stuck in this place.
Hmm.
I was a teenager at the time. Um, the other things, the experiences that I started doing after I left the community are just me trying to
Give me one moment. There's another interruption that
learn about life.
Okay. Apologies for that.
No worries.
So you were saying that you wanted to learn about life. I think we have a slight delay.
Like things that I do now, for example, like traveling or watching documentaries. I like to watch informative things, not necessarily documentaries, just informative videos. Uh, Not necessarily about things that I need in life, kind of like I said earlier, like how the earthquakes happen and things like that. I'm a curious fella. So traveling and all of that is just trying to learn about the world, everything I missed.
It also sounds like because you couldn't leave physically, you were leaving psychologically through drugs. That was another way of escaping.
Right. I very much didn't like where I was. And I wanted to add another note. The reason I'm so curious now on really minor things like how the earthquakes happen is because of the education that I got or didn't get in the community, I should add. Um, we learned mostly religious studies and completely skipped out on English, math, science, social studies, and all of that. So now I'm trying to make up for that.
So, what is it you were learning in school instead of the usual subjects of math and history and things like that? What you say religious studies, but what does that entail for someone who's not familiar with that?
Right. So, in addition to the Bible, there's a lot of written scripture, and we would just study that, and we would have tests on that. Problem is that it's not really applicable to real life. It was things that are. I'll just give you one example that everyone says. We learned what do we do if my cow hit your cow, 2,000 years ago? Who has to pay the damage? Things like that. And it was all examples of 2,000 years ago, or I don't know exactly how many years ago, but not from the 1900s or 2000s. So it was all that, and it was a lot of preaching by the school staff, a lot of praying, and yeah, some lunch in between.
And when you left, what was the best thing about that experience, and what was the worst thing about that experience?
The best thing would be just leaving, coming out, and finally being free. Because on that
Hmm.
very day that I came out as not religious, on that very day I was still suffering from this. So it was a Friday night. I was invited to hang out with friends in recovery. I was already trying to get clean at the time. It wasn't working, but I was trying. Um, I was hanging out with some friends in recovery on a Friday night, and they were in Manhattan. I was in Williamsburg, so I had to take the train. And it was Friday night, so Shabbat. So I wasn't allowed to take the train. I had to put on a hoodie and sunglasses at night and hide myself and make sure nobody sees me on the way. They invited me to hang out with them the next day as well on Saturday morning in a park. and it was very hot outside. Again, I had to wear a hoodie and sunglasses and hide myself. I was there at the park with him. It was so hot. I took out my phone and I looked at barbershops in the area. I found one. I just left there. I went there. I went to the barbershop. I told him cut these off and this, and, the beard and the pace. And then I just went back to the picnic in the park, and the people there were like, I feel like I've seen you before because I look so different.
Yeah. How did that feel?
So that was a good thing because it felt very freeing because I was just then, even that day, suffering from having to hide from the community. So coming out and then posting on Facebook, this is me now, deal with it. That was just like exciting. I was very excited to see what's going to happen next. And at the same time, I was scared because a lot of people before have, tried the path and didn't make it through. So it's kind of scary too, but it was freeing. It was worth it. It was definitely worth it.
And what was that path of leaving? You said you moved to Florida. Um, you know, what was the experience? Obviously, there's an excitement in this secret that you've been holding in is something that you no longer have to keep secret. But what did that look like? A month from then, 6 months, a year, as this is no longer just something you've just done, but something you're actively doing.
Right. At first, I was intrigued by other religions. I was already, at the time, I wasn't an atheist. I more so hated God.
Hmm.
Um, um, during my addiction years, I hadn't really defined my atheism. I wasn't really sure what I believe and what I don't believe. Um, Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
You were still defining what it is you believe after, because you
Right,
no longer
after
believed in
after I
the
left.
Hasidic conception, but you weren't quite sure what you believed
Right, but I,
instead.
I wanted to check out other things to give it a chance. I checked out Christianity and I spoke to people of various religions, in various parts in religions. But ultimately, I realized that they all have the same. It's all the same, just a different color.
Hmm. What is the
Meaning, like
sameness that
Christianity
they
and
share?
Judaism, it's like the same thing, different flag.
What is the similarity or the common thread between them that you noticed?
Uh, they all talk about a God that is so much higher than you. You are nothing. The God is everything. You gotta pray to that God. You gotta basically base your whole life on that idea, and you can't question it. You know. Also, God wants your money. It's very important.
That's a funny similarity to notice, but it's definitely there.
It's there.
So, at what point did you realize or decide that you didn't believe in God at all? What point did that become clear?
It didn't happen at one time. It happened over the course of, my addiction years, first hating God and then realizing that there is no God. There's no hate to be carried here.
Hmm.
I don't remember exactly when that changed, but it was after giving the other religions an honest chance.
And what is it you were doing during this time? You mentioned addiction, and then, of course, there was a move to Florida, but were you working anywhere? Were you meeting different people? What else was going on
In
in your
Florida, I
life?
was working on myself. In Florida, I was going to rehab and then halfway house, sober living, intensive therapy. I was just trying to become a mensch. And it was really hard because my English was still very broken at the time. And I had to repeat things and I had to ask people to repeat things because I didn't understand them. Um, but it was good. It was good because I didn't have anyone to speak Yiddish with. So my English got better.
Speaking as a non-Yiddish speaker, you'll have to define mensch for me.
Mensch means person, but it
Okay,
means more than that. It means like a good person. When somebody's a mensch, they're a real person.
I see. And so you were working on yourself there, um, and it's shown in the documentary, and you also have talked about this during the interview, that at some point you went back and began living with that community again. So what was the decision there? How did that happen?
So at first, I just missed everything that I knew, my network of people that I did have. So after about 6 months in Florida, I came back to New York. But that was a mistake in hindsight because I should have stayed in Florida longer and worked on my recovery longer because then I relapsed
Hmm.
after coming back. I didn't move in right away, like in a Hasidic building. For a few years, actually, I was living in a non-Jewish building with just a different set of people, not my family and not anyone in the community. But a few years ago, I moved back into a Hasidic building and not really officially, but kind of like rejoined different traditions. I started going to Shabbat meals here and there.
So it sounds like you wanted the support network that comes with having a community, with having people you know, and some familiarity. Is that accurate to say? Or
Yeah, not necessarily the support network, because I like to think that I'm independent. Um, at least I want to be as much as possible. I mean, I know people need other people, but I want to be independent as much as possible. So I don't as much need the network, but I missed it. It's nice to have it,
yeah.
and my family is here, and it's nice to be around. Ultimately, my goal is to retire upstate or in a different state, but for now I'm here.
And you also
And
mentioned.
also, like
Go
I
ahead.
said, I want to watch the show. Right? Is that what you're gonna bring up? I wanna be here. Another reason I came back is because I wanna see it changing, and it's very interesting how it is.
What is the change that you'd like to see, or that you're hoping to see?
Well, for starters, something that I've always thought would be a good idea is an independent therapist in every Hasidic school that is not paid for by the school, paid for by the government or someone else. An independent licensed therapist who's not afraid of the community leaders because they can't fire them. Because if they can be fired by community leaders, there's no point in it.
Hmm.
Someone who wouldn't be afraid to speak out if necessary. But I don't think that's going to happen as much. I think what is more likely to happen is mental health becoming a real um, talked about point. And the second thing, what I want to see is education coming into Hasidic schools because right now the education is an absolute disaster and people are coming out of school. Like I came out of school with a high school diploma. I went to college. I was so happy. I'm going to learn computers. I'm very into computers and technology. I have a technology company now, but even back then I was always into computers. I go to college with excitement. They look at my my high school diploma and they say, "Come back with another one. This isn't real."
Wow.
That's 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 how little they teach.
It sounds like what you're hoping to see is someone from outside that community advocating for the people and children in that community, both for their mental health and their education.
Unfortunately, right. Unfortunately, people in the community can't advocate as much because they'll get backlash. So it ends up being kind of like this weird position where only people who have left the community and no longer really have a stake in it, only those people end up fighting for it. So we get a lot of backlash. By we, I mean Fed, which is not me. It's an organization that I support. Um, Fed gets a lot of backlash saying that you're outsiders. Why do you care so much about the community? Why do you care about the education of the community? Well, only the outsiders get to speak out because the people inside don't get to do that.
So if you're inside the system and the community, there are you could lose things that are important to you because that community has power over you. But if you're outside,
Right.
then they can't pressure you the same way.
Right. I mean, even though I live in a Hasidic building with a Hasidic landlord, I have the comfortability that I signed the lease, and they don't have as like I don't have kids in Hasidic schools that can be kicked out, and there's no I'm not afraid to be kicked out of a shul or a synagogue.
You also mentioned doing therapy when you were in Florida, and then mental health and therapists being something you'd like to see more of. What is it that you feel like you got from therapy or you learned during that process? I ask in part because my wife does healing work, and that's something that I and her have both been interested in a long time. So I'm curious what experiences you had with that and what things you feel like it brought you.
It brought me so much. I was able to get over a lot of trauma without facing my issues. Meaning I had to face my issues, yes, but without in therapy I got over a lot of things without breaking things.
Hmm. I, I I
If that
know
makes
what you mean.
sense.
Yeah, you didn't. Um, you were able to resolve the issue internally, so you didn't have to do something externally, which would then have external
Right.
consequences.
Yeah. Possible repercussions.
And if you don't have to share if you don't want to, but are there any things that you resolved during therapy or worked through or um, that you might feel comfortable sharing or that you might have noticed that others are also dealing with in that community?
Well, if there's someone who's listening now who is dealing with a sexual assault in their history, um, I can wholeheartedly recommend therapy. And I'll give you an example. I used to work at a Hasidic store. Name is not doesn't matter. Um, but one of the frequent customers was someone who sexually assaulted me when I was really young, and I was able to face him and deal with him from time to time and not freak out as I otherwise would. So I think like self-control is something that I got out of rehab and therapy.
Hmm. And that's something that you also talked about in the documentary was sexual abuse in that community. So I'm curious, um, both how common that is, and then how do they usually handle that? How do they respond to it?
Right, that is another thing that I'm really hoping is going to change, and I think it's kind of changing. So the first part of your question was how often it's happening, and for that I have no answer because, as I said before, the information flow in the community is tightly controlled, and I don't know. People call, if they do call someone, they would call Shumram, which is more of an internal police rather than the actual 911 police. Uh, so numbers I wouldn't have for you. What happens next, like what happens after something like that happens, is unfortunately sad because nothing happens.
Hmm.
The cases that I was not really involved with, the cases that I witnessed, including myself, like my own story, um, nothing was really done in terms of giving the kid a therapist or bringing someone to justice. But I think in the last few years that the mindset in the community has changed a lot towards not supporting abusers as much as they used to. Because in the past, abusers were supported and protected, and that's just, I don't get it.
What was the support because they thought this is one of us and we don't want the like what why was it they were supported?
Because they probably didn't want the story to leak.
Hmm.
If someone gets convicted, the story ends up in the news. If someone doesn't get convicted, I guess it's not news. I don't know.
So it was a desire to protect the image of the community.
I think so.
And I mean, I'm also curious, for the people who are survivors in that community, how do they emotionally process it? Because I'm sure you're not the only one. So have you talked to others, and I'm sort of curious how they've responded
How they responded to what?
to, well, how do they handle it? Um, do when you began talking about your experiences, were there other people who came to you who had similar ones? Um,
Yes, a lot of people had reached out, especially after the movie, and it was varying responses. There was this one guy who reached out on Instagram, fake accounts, who said some horrible things, said that he was assaulted when he was younger and it didn't do anything wrong to him. In fact, he's doing it to other kids now and he's not seeing any problem with that. And I'm
wow.
looking at the message and I'm like, how can you think that nothing bad happened if the cycle continues?
Yeah,
So there's
that's
been
pretty bad.
responses like that, and there's been other responses of support and also requests for support. I usually send everyone to professionals that I know, whether it being professionals a part of Footsteps or other um, Zaka or other organizations that deal with this.
I should ask, because Footsteps is another organization mentioned in the documentary. What role, like, were you a part of any of those organizations, and what role do they play? Um, I'm curious, sort of how people get involved with them or discover them, or is it something that's talked about in the community and people know that they can go to, or is it something that they kind of have to discover in some way?
Well, it is talked about in the community, but in a very negative light. They're saying that Footsteps is coming into the community and stealing kids from their parents, which is totally untrue. Footsteps never goes into the Hasidic community. That's not their policy. It's their policy not to. Like they don't do demonstrations or anything like that. Um, if someone reaches out to them for help, they'll help, of course. That's how they work. So in the community, it is talked about, but in a negative light. Um, Funny enough, the way I heard about it first was because I was asked to write an article against them, and I did my research. I was young at the time. I did my research. I looked into it, and I was like, this is. I should give them a call, but I wasn't 18 at the time, so I couldn't join Footsteps. But I joined not long after I turned 18.
That's funny. I've heard of people in the Christian community and other religious communities leaving for similar reasons. That in the process of being opposition, they actually consider the other person's perspective and have a change of heart.
Yeah.
Um, how is it? So you mentioned that they're actually. First, I want to ask, how is it that the Hasidic community perceives the larger Jewish community and other denominations of Judaism? And I'm also curious how the other versions of Judaism perceive the Hasidic. Like, are they sort of seeing themselves as part of the same thing, or do they see themselves as different, or how is that
No.
perceived?
Hasidic Jews see themselves as better Jews than everybody else. They're more Jewish than everybody else. They're true Jews. But when it comes the other way around, I think like let's say someone who's modern Orthodox or less religious wouldn't see Hasidic Jews as not Jewish. They would just see them as a different version of Judaism, which is true. Judaism has a lot of different versions, just like Christianity and other religions.
Do they get along on most issues, or do they clash? Because I know that there's places where different denominations of religions do both of those things.
Um, for the most part, different versions of Judaism get along these days. Back in the day, there was a lot more clashes, but now it's mostly peaceful.
And I'm curious how the Hasidic and Jewish organizations in general perceive criticism from the outside? So you mentioned that there was initially a lot of resistance to any outside mental health professionals of any kind or acknowledging things like sexual abuse. If that criticism comes from people who are not members of that community, is it received differently than if it's from someone like yourself who is at least part of that community initially, or is it received differently? Like it's only, it can only, I'm just sort of curious what the perception is to sort of outside organizations and groups and people trying to help on these problems or make changes of some kind.
Right. I think that when people inside the community speak out negatively about the community, it's seen as sort of, hey, you're a traitor. Like, how come you betray us like that? If someone from the outside of the community is criticizing the community, well, they're an outsider. Who cares about their opinion? If someone who's left is criticizing the community, well, you left. Why do you care? So there's always the answer of your opinion doesn't matter because this and this reason. I think that's why I have a unique perspective because I left. I completely got over, or at least I like to think so. I got over my traumas of the past, and then I came back, sort of clear-minded about the situation. And that's why I think my criticism, if I do, I pretty often criticize the Hasidic community in different ways, should be seen as genuine because I was there. I know what's going on. I left. I had a completely different perspective, and I came back because I like it, not because I hate it.
Hmm. So at this point, you're able to approach them as having both the outside perspective and as a friend,
Right.
having both of those qualities, which is rare.
Right.
And have they received it in that way? Have they, understood that what you're doing is, and the things you're talking about are intended in the spirit of friendship and helping people to, heal the things that they need and change in the ways that benefit them?
Yes, actually, there have been a lot of people who have accepted my negative things about the community very well. I have friends that I communicate with all the time, and it's a topic worth discussing, and we discuss it all the time. Um, my support for Yafed is like my friends know about it, and we discuss it all the time as well. And it's it's not liked in the community, but I think they understand it.
That's good to hear.
For those who don't know, I should mention Yafed is Young Advocates for Fair Education. It's an organization that is um, trying to get uh, proper education into Hasidic schools. So it's hated by the community because they don't want to do that.
They would prefer to keep the education entirely religious rather than mixing it with.
Entirely internal and controlled, yes. As opposed to having substantial equivalency to the high schools. I mean, to public schools, which they're legally required to.
So I'm, because of the documentary that I did and the work that I've done, I have some overlap with people who are working on other issues that also overlap with Jewish issues, namely the issue of circumcision. So I'm curious how they respond to criticism of that or of other issues that overlap with both the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world. Is that something where that criticism is received differently or is received differently based on who it comes from?
Criticism about circumcision is seen as complete like anti-Semitism
Okay.
for whatever reason. Even though
So
I see criticism of circumcision as a completely logical point, it's seen as very much like, hey, they're coming for us, you know.
So any criticism of circumcision is like,
is met with defense.
and it sounds like there's almost if you were to do a Venn diagram, it's like a complete one circle inside another. Criticism of circumcision and anti-Semitism from their perspective are basically the same thing.
Right.
I should ask, how is it that both they and other Jewish groups define anti-Semitism? Because one of the things that I've heard people in the intactivist movement or who are working on changing things on the issue of circumcision say is they'll say, "Oh, well, we're not, criticizing Jewish people. We're talking about the issue of circumcision." But it sounds like the perspective that they have is different. So I'm curious how they understand anti-Semitism and what their definition is there, because it sounds like if people are going to have a discussion about that, they need to understand that definition better.
Right. Well, unfortunately, in Hasidic schools, the definition of anti-Semitism isn't taught very well. Anti-Semitism is real. It's happening all over the world, and unfortunately, some people use it, every time a cop gives them a ticket, and it diminishes the real meaning of anti-Semitism. But if you're asking me how they see it, I can't tell you because I wasn't taught anything about it growing up.
So it's not something that is given a very strict dictionary definition, but it is something that's culturally understood.
It's culturally understood, and there's something else. There's a saying we say "Eisef Soinu Yaakov," which is it translates to the non-Jew hates the Jew.
So there's a belief that anyone who isn't Jewish must, on some level,
By
according to them.
default, hates the Jews. That's just that's the general belief.
Where does that belief come from, or what's the thinking behind it?
I think generational trauma.
Hmm.
There's a lot of generational trauma where I come from.
I'm curious to hear more about that. So, if I'm guessing correctly, it comes from historical persecution.
Right.
How does that
Uh,
manifest, or how does that trauma work?
well, everything is internal, everything is controlled by the community. We don't have to rely on anyone else. We have our own police, our own ambulance service, our own AAA service, our own uh, bus services going around in some areas. I think it translated to a very closed system, a closed ecosystem that doesn't interact with the rest of the world very much, or doesn't want to interact very much with the rest of the world.
So, any interaction with the outside world is assumed to be messing with that system in some way, or potentially
Right,
harming it.
endangering it.
Hmm. That's a really difficult place to have a conversation from if you assume that the other party is coming with ill will. Everything they do might mess up the world you've created. Um, is there a way for people who are outside that
Right.
community to have the conversation, or um, does something else have to change there? I don't know.
Um, well, I guess approach it
Uh,
friendly is all I'm gonna say, I think.
sure. Actually,
Some people will not want to talk to you, and some people might talk to you. But I think if you're friendly enough, then most Hasidic people will be friendly to you. If you come in with cameras, then they'll run. But if you come in just as a person trying to talk, you'll find that a lot of Hasidic people are open to just talking, at least.
I should ask, what is the understanding within that community, if you don't mind me asking, of circumcision?
Oh, the understanding is that we must do it. It's the word of God, and that's the end of the story. It's very much, this is how we do it. I'm sure you know how it's done. I'm sure you've done your research on circumcision. You're familiar with the issue. So yeah, this is how it's done. This is why God wants, and end of story.
It strikes me a bit like the explanation for earthquakes. It's
Right.
God doesn't.
It's the same God because of God. I like to say, you know how Google, I don't know if they still do it, when you Google something, on the bottom of the page you have a lot of O's. I feel like the God answer is the same thing. You just add as many O's as you need to fit the answer, but it's the same word every time.
You're reminding me of a joke that I heard about Sunday school in Christianity, which was that there's a Sunday school teacher talking to the class and says, and then God created the animals, and he created one that has a little bushy tail and it likes running up trees and collecting nuts. And can you kids tell me what animal that is? And one of the kids says, well, I know the answer to every question in Sunday school is always Jesus, but that sure sounds like a squirrel. And it strikes me as something similar. That we know the answer is always because God wants it, but it sure sounds like there might be another explanation.
Yeah.
So
I
I'm
don't
curious.
get it though. I don't, as much as I've tried, I don't get a logical explanation for circumcision. I've looked for it. As much as I've tried though, I couldn't find one.
So that was one of the other things you questioned as a part of leaving that community and doing your
I
own
didn't
research.
question it when I was younger because I didn't really know about it when I was younger. I didn't, like, it was done to me when I was 8 days old. I definitely do not
Yeah.
remember that. But later on in life, when I heard more about it, especially when I heard, I've never seen a circumcision done, but I've heard, you know, about how it's done. I don't like it.
Do you think there's ever a possibility of that changing in the Jewish community, or is that something that mm, you there's
I
less of a
think a
possibility?
circumcision is not going to change anytime soon. Definitely not soon. A lot of things will change, yeah. I think people will be a lot more chilled out, a lot more mellow about the whole situation, about Judaism in general, about Hasidic Judaism more specifically. Um, but the core beliefs will definitely stay, and I don't think it's going to change even in my lifetime. Just
One
being
of the
realistic here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the realism and the honesty. I think that's important to be in reality about whatever it is that you're focused on or learning about. Um, with the issue of circumcision, um, I had thought and then I lost it. Um, I remember what I was going to ask, which is that is so when I've talked about this issue before, one of the things that I've heard Jewish people say is that circumcision is central to Jewish identity. And I was curious if, based on your experiences and what you know of the Jewish community, if you thought that was true. Is Jewish identity possible without it, or is it
Of
is it
course,
actually central?
according to the Bible itself, I think there's three things that are the Jewish identity. That's Shem, Levish, and what is that? I haven't learned the Bible in a while, and it shows. Um, there's three things that uh, I make the Jewish identification. That's the name, the language, and the clothing. Circumcision is not one of them.
Name, language, clothing. So, what
Yeah.
can you expand on that? Because I've not heard that definition of Jewish identity before. How is it that you would
Yeah.
define that?
Um, well, as I said, I haven't learned the Bible in a while. I haven't studied that in a while. So, specifics I'll get to you. But I think it's related to the story of Egypt. When Jews were in Egypt, the reason they stayed Jewish for so long was because of their they didn't change their names, they didn't change their clothing, and they didn't change their language. That's what kept them Jewish, and that's what they were praised for in the Bible.
I could see name, language, and clothing as being like very easily also identifiers of culture. Like if you change your name and the way you look and the words and
Way you
language that you're
speak.
speaking. Yeah, those are the things you usually have to change if you're trying to adapt to a different culture, or if you go to a foreign country or things like that.
Hmm.
So, what is next for you? Are there things that you're working on now or exploring now, or where is it that you're looking to go from here?
Well, I'm just trying to make a living, honestly, at this point. I've gotten through the trauma of my past. I'm no longer ex-Hasidic. I like to say that I'm no longer ex-Hasidic. I've moved on. I'm not even ex-Hasidic anymore. I have a company now. It's called Telon Technologies, and I build custom-built computers, and I do all kinds of computer work, and that's what keeps me busy most of the time. And in my free time, I do some activism here and there.
What sort of activism are you doing now?
Sometimes about education, like I mentioned earlier, the work with Yafed, um, and the rest is political, so I won't bring it up.
Sure. Is there anything else that you want to talk about that we haven't talked about, that you were hoping I'd ask about, or that you're aching to talk about that we didn't get to?
I'm not sure. There isn't anything in particular that I wanted to bring up. There's no plug. I'm not releasing a book or anything like that. Um, not yet, at least.
All right. One other thing I wanted to ask, which was, what was the reaction that you got from the various people in your life to being in a documentary and having your story out there in such a public way?
Good question. I'm glad you asked that. That was a wonderful experience because I don't know if you've heard the term before. The trash is taking itself out. Have you heard that term before?
I haven't, but I think I
Um,
understand the
there's
concept.
probably different versions. There's probably different versions of this term in different languages. It was basically everybody who was afraid of a camera left my life, and that's okay because I don't like if you're afraid of a camera, it's most likely because you're very traumatized by that or basically a certain kind of person that I left, a certain type of person that I went away from.
I think I had a similar experience making a documentary. Is that anyone who wasn't aligned to who I was and was trying to be just kind of like left the scene. Um, so
Yeah, I noticed I once walked up to two people on the street that I knew, and they asked me, like, they started walking away from me, and I was like, I asked them why. So, like, is there a camera here? Like, so I was like, okay, if you're afraid of a camera, then just go.
it's good to put your values out there because you start attracting the people who are right for you and getting rid of those that aren't. So I
Right.
appreciate you being willing to do that and share your story.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add before we finish up?
Um. Hmm. I mean, I just wanted to say that Hasidic Judaism, that there's a couple of things that the film didn't really finish on because
Sure.
after all it was a 90-minute film after all, and they can't fit everything in because the story is
Yeah,
way too complex for even
I'm
100
familiar with that
hours.
challenge.
Yeah, you gotta fit in whatever you can. So one thing they didn't finish on was my sobriety, and I'm actually gonna reveal something on the show on
Oh,
this podcast. I've been clean for more than 4 years from narcotics, but I have started smoking weed again after a few years of being clean from narcotics, and it's been a huge help.
are you doing it as
So,
like a sort of therapeutic thing, or are you doing it just because it feels good?
yes, therapeutic. It is
Okay.
therapeutic. I've replaced some medication with weed.
Well, congrats on staying clean and finding what works for you.
And another thing that the film didn't really finish on was how Hasidic Judaism is constantly evolving. And
Hmm.
that's why, like I said, I'm sticking around for the show. So I'm excited to see where Hasidic Judaism is going to go. The hatred towards it has changed to curiosity now.
Curiosity is a good place to be. Well, thanks again for sharing your story. And I hope that the show delivers everything that you're hoping for.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brendon Marotta Show. If you liked this episode, please share it with someone else who would also like it, and then go on whatever platform you listen to the show on and leave a positive review. If you want to support the show directly, go to brendonmarotta.com/show and subscribe there. Paid subscribers get special unreleased bonus material and live events that are only available to them. Once again, that is brendonmarotta.com/show. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you all later.